What happens when the most well-trained, disciplined guards in the world suddenly freeze like statues? When men who have sworn to protect the crown with their lives find themselves paralyzed by something so unexpected that their minds cannot process what they're seeing. This isn't about fear of danger or a threat to security. This is about the moment when protocol meets humanity, when duty collides with disbelief, and when even the most composed individuals discover that some situations simply cannot be prepared for, no matter how much training you've received. Picture this: the grand corridors of a royal residence where every footstep echoes with centuries of history. Guards stand at attention, their eyes trained to notice every detail, their bodies ready to respond to any threat. They've seen dignitaries, celebrities, and world leaders. They've handled state visits, royal ceremonies, and public appearances. Nothing surprises them anymore, or so they thought. But on this particular day, something happens that doesn't fit into any manual, doesn't match any protocol they've memorized, and certainly wasn't covered in their extensive training. The guards freeze. Not because they're scared, not because they're confused about their duties, but because what unfolds before them is so extraordinary, so completely outside the realm of their experience that their minds simply cannot compute what to do next. And then, in the midst of this unprecedented moment of uncertainty, one voice cuts through the silence, a voice that carries the weight of centuries, the authority of bloodline, and the power to transform a moment of chaos into something entirely different. Prince William speaks and everything changes. This is that story. A true account of the day when even the most unflappable guardians of the crown discovered that reality can be stranger, more touching, and more human than any protocol ever written. It's a story about duty and compassion, about rules and exceptions, and about the moment when a future king showed that sometimes the most royal thing you can do is simply be human. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace as Guard Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time that day. 23 years of service to the crown had taught him that appearances mattered, but more importantly that vigilance never took a holiday. At 45 years old, Mitchell had seen 3 generations of royals pass through these corridors, and he prided himself on being unshakable, unflappable, and utterly professional in every situation. The palace was buzzing with its usual morning activity. Staff members moved with practiced efficiency, their footsteps muffled by centuries-old Persian rugs that had witnessed more history than most museums. The smell of fresh flowers from the arrangements that were changed daily, mixed with the subtle scent of polish from the mahogany panels that lined the walls, everything was exactly as it should be. Ordered, pristine, and running like the well-oiled machine that royal households were famous for being. Mitchell's team of 6 guards had been briefed on the day's schedule during their early morning meeting. Prince William was expected to host a private meeting with several charity representatives in the Blue Drawing Room at 10:30. It was a routine engagement, the kind that filled the royal calendar week after week. The representatives from 3 different children's charities would present their quarterly reports and discuss upcoming fundraising events. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that would require special security measures beyond their standard protocols. The guards had taken their positions throughout the east wing of the palace with military precision. Guard Corporal Sarah Davies stood at the main entrance, her keen eyes scanning everyone who approached. At 28, Davies was relatively new to royal protection duty, but her background in military intelligence made her invaluable for spotting potential problems before they developed. Her blonde hair was pulled back in the regulation style, and her uniform was immaculate, every button polished to a mirror shine. Guard Private Thomas Chen had been assigned to the corridor leading to the Blue Drawing Room. At 32, Chen brought a calm presence to the team, his background in conflict resolution proving useful during the occasional tense moment with overeager visitors or photographers. His parents had immigrated from Hong Kong when he was young, and he often reflected on how surreal it was that their son now helped protect the British royal family. The charity representatives had arrived promptly at 10:15, just as their advance team had indicated they would. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton from the Children's Hospital Foundation looked exactly like what central casting would order for a charity director. Silver hair perfectly styled, sensible shoes, and a briefcase that had clearly seen years of use in service of good causes. She was accompanied by her assistant, a nervous young man named David who kept checking his phone and adjusting his glasses. Mr. Robert Harrison from the Youth Education Initiative was a stark contrast to Mrs. Pemberton. At 38, he had the energy and enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed he could change the world, one child at a time. His slightly rumpled suit and animated gestures when he spoke gave him an approachable quality that had made him successful in his fundraising efforts. He carried a tablet loaded with presentations and spoke in rapid bursts about literacy programs and computer labs. The third representative was Dr. Maria Santos from the International Children's Relief Organization. Born in Brazil but raised in London, Dr. Santos brought a global perspective to her work that had impressed the royal family's charitable coordinators. Her dark eyes held the kind of compassion that comes from having seen real suffering, but also the determination of someone who refuses to give up hope. She carried herself with quiet dignity and spoke with a slight accent that made her words seem more thoughtful and deliberate. Mitchell watched as the three representatives were escorted through the security checkpoint by Palace Staff Coordinator Jennifer Walsh. Walsh had been working at the palace for 15 years and knew the routines better than anyone. She guided visitors with the perfect balance of warmth and efficiency, making them feel welcome while ensuring they understood the protocols they needed to follow. The guards went through their standard procedures without really thinking about them. Mitchell positioned himself where he could observe both the corridor and the entrance to the blue drawing room. Davies remained at her post, monitoring the flow of people through the main entrance. Chen took up his position in the hallway, close enough to respond quickly if needed, but far enough away to give the meeting privacy. As 10:30 approached, the representatives were gathered in the antechamber outside the blue drawing room. Mrs. Untold Pemberton organized her papers one final time. Mr. Harrison checked his tablet presentation and Dr. Santos sat quietly, mentally reviewing the points she wanted to make about their emergency relief programs. The atmosphere was professional but relaxed. These were experienced people who had participated in similar meetings before. At exactly 10:28, the distinctive sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. The guards automatically straightened, their training kicking in even though this was a routine encounter. Prince William's security detail appeared first, two plainclothes officers who positioned themselves strategically before nodding to Mitchell that everything was secure. Prince William emerged from around the corner, and immediately the atmosphere in the palace shifted in that subtle way it always did when royalty appeared. He was dressed in a navy blue suit that was clearly expensive but not flashy, his appearance striking the perfect balance between formality and approachability that had made him popular with the public. At 43 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of someone born to leadership, but without the arrogance that sometimes accompanied such positions. The charity representatives rose as he entered the antechamber, and Prince William greeted each of them personally. His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct, and his questions about their work showed that he had actually read the briefing materials his staff had prepared. This wasn't just royal duty. He seemed genuinely interested in what they were doing. Mrs. Pemberton, I was particularly impressed by your hospital's new wing for pediatric cancer patients, he said, his voice carrying the kind of warmth that made people feel heard and valued. The photos in your report showed some remarkable recovery stories. Mrs. Pemberton beamed with pride as she thanked him for taking the time to review their materials so thoroughly. Mr. Harrison was equally pleased when Prince William asked specific questions about the literacy programs they were implementing in underserved communities. Dr. Santos found herself genuinely moved when he inquired about the emotional support they provide to families affected by natural disasters. The meeting began in the blue drawing room, a space that managed to be both grand and intimate. The walls were covered in silk wallpaper, in a shade of blue that had been specially created for the palace, and the furniture was an elegant mix of antiques and comfortable seating that encouraged conversation. Portraits of previous royals looked down from the walls, but somehow their presence felt protective rather than intimidating. Mitchell and his team settled into their routine monitoring positions. This was the kind of assignment they could handle in their sleep. Low risk, familiar faces, predictable timeline. The meeting was scheduled to last 90 minutes, after which the representatives would be escorted out through the same route they had entered. Everything was going exactly according to plan, but sometimes even the most carefully planned days have a way of surprising everyone involved. And on this particular morning, a surprise was heading towards Kensington Palace that would test every protocol, challenge every assumption, and ultimately remind everyone present that humanity has a way of breaking through even the most rigid systems. The first sign that something unusual was happening came at approximately 10:45, when Davies noticed an unusual amount of activity near the main gate. A small group of people had gathered, but they weren't the typical tourists or photographers who sometimes congregated hoping for a glimpse of royalty. These people looked different, more purposeful, more emotional, more desperate. Chen noticed it too from his position in the corridor. Through one of the tall windows, he could see what appeared to be a family, 2 adults and what looked like a child standing near the palace gates. They weren't trying to get closer or calling out like typical visitors might. Instead, they stood quietly, almost hesitantly, as if unsure whether they belonged there. The unusual thing was their appearance. While the palace regularly received visitors who dressed in their finest clothes for the occasion, these people looked like they had traveled a long distance and hadn't had time to prepare. Their clothes were clean but worn, and they carried themselves with the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from dealing with a crisis that has gone on too long. Mitchell received a quiet update through his earpiece from the exterior security team. A family had approached the gates claiming to have vital information about one of the charities meeting with Prince William that day. They had no appointment, no identification that would grant them access, and no contacts within the palace who could vouch for them. Under normal circumstances, they would be politely turned away and given information about proper channels for contacting the royal family. But there was something about this family that gave the security team pause. The woman was holding what appeared to be medical documents, and she kept looking at a photograph she clutched in her other hand. The man beside her had the kind of desperate determination in his eyes that security personnel learned to recognize. The look of someone who has exhausted all other options and is making one last attempt to be heard. Most concerning was the child with them, a girl who appeared to be around 8 years old, wearing a colorful scarf wrapped around her head. Even from a distance, it was clear that she was seriously ill. She leaned heavily against the woman, conserving her energy, but her eyes were bright and alert as she looked up at the imposing facade of Kensington Palace. The exterior security team faced a dilemma. Their protocols were clear: unauthorized visitors, regardless of their apparent circumstances, were not to be admitted without proper verification and advance arrangements. The safety and security of the royal family depended on these protocols being followed without exception. But human nature has a way of complicating even the most straightforward situations. The security officers found themselves looking at a family that was clearly in distress, with a child who was obviously facing serious health challenges, standing outside one of the most powerful institutions in the world, hoping that someone would listen to them. The head of exterior security, Captain Richard Thornton, made a decision that would set the day's extraordinary events in motion. Instead of immediately turning the family away, he decided to at least hear what they had to say. If their claims proved to be unfounded or if they posed any kind of security risk, they could still be removed from the premises. But if there was even a possibility that they had legitimate business related to the ongoing charity meeting, it was worth investigating. Captain Thornton approached the family personally, his demeanor professional but not unfriendly. The woman immediately stepped forward, her words tumbling out in a rush of emotion and desperation. Her name was Maria Gonzalez, and she and her husband Carlos had traveled from Manchester with their 8-year-old daughter Isabella. Isabella was fighting leukemia, and they had been following the work of the Children's Hospital Foundation closely because their daughter was on the waiting list for an experimental treatment program. What made their visit urgent, Maria explained, was that they had discovered something troubling about the foundation's operations. Through their involvement with other families in similar situations, they had learned that funds designated for the experimental treatment program were being diverted to other projects. Children who had been promised access to life-saving treatments were being told that the program was temporarily suspended while the foundation dealt with administrative issues. Maria held up the photograph she had been clutching, a picture of Isabella taken before her illness, showing a vibrant, smiling girl with long, dark hair. The contrast between that image and the frail child standing beside her was heartbreaking. But Isabella's current appearance wasn't what made Captain Thornton pause. It was the determination in her young eyes and the way she straightened up when she heard her mother explaining their situation. Carlos added that they had tried to contact the foundation directly, but had been told repeatedly that their concerns would be looked into without ever receiving any concrete responses. They had reached out to local media, but their story had been dismissed as the complaints of desperate parents who didn't understand the complexities of medical research funding. They had contacted their local MP, who had promised to make inquiries but had produced no results. Learning that Mrs. Pemberton was meeting with Prince William that very morning had felt like a sign, Maria said. If they could just speak to someone with real authority, someone who could ask the hard questions that the foundation had been avoiding, maybe they could ensure that Isabella and the other children wouldn't lose their chance at life-saving treatment. Captain Thornton found himself in an unprecedented situation. His training told him to follow established protocols and remove the family from the premises. But his conscience told him that this wasn't a typical case of overeager visitors or attention-seeking troublemakers. This was a family facing the potential loss of their child, and they had information that could be relevant to an ongoing royal meeting. The decision he made next would ripple through the palace, challenging protocols, surprising guards, and ultimately creating a situation that would require Prince William himself to navigate uncharted territory. Captain Thornton spoke quietly into his radio, requesting immediate consultation with Mitchell and the interior security team. He explained the situation in careful, measured terms, outlining both the family's claims and the potential security implications of allowing them access to the palace.
Mitchell listened to the update with growing concern.
The meeting in the blue drawing room was proceeding normally, with Mrs. Pemberton presenting her foundation's quarterly report with apparent confidence and enthusiasm. Prince William was asking detailed questions and seemed genuinely pleased with the progress being described. The atmosphere in the room was positive and productive, but if the family's allegations were true, then Mrs. Pemberton was potentially misleading Prince William about her foundation's operations. The implications were serious, not just for the foundation and the children it served, but for the royal family's reputation and their careful vetting process for charitable partnerships. Mitchell faced a decision that went far beyond his usual duties. His job was to ensure physical security, not to investigate potential fraud or misconduct by charity representatives. But he also understood that protecting the royal family meant protecting them from being unknowingly associated with questionable organizations. As he weighed his options, Mitchell was acutely aware that whatever decision he made would have consequences. If he allowed the family access and their allegations prove false, he could be accused of disrupting an important royal engagement based on unsubstantiated claims. If he turned them away and their allegations proved true, he could be accused of failing to protect Prince William from a potentially damaging association. The complexity of the situation was unlike anything in his 23 years of service, and Mitchell realized that this was going to be one of those days that would be remembered and discussed for years to come, regardless of how it was handled. Inside the blue drawing room, Prince William continued his meeting, completely unaware that outside the palace walls, a decision was being made that would soon test his own ability to handle the unexpected with grace, compassion, and wisdom. Prince William's expression remained carefully composed as Mitchell began his explanation, but the slight tightening around his eyes indicated that he was processing information that was more serious than routine security concerns. The antechamber, with its elegant furniture and ancestral portraits, seemed to shrink as the weight of the situation became clear. "Your Royal Highness," Mitchell continued, his 23 years of service lending gravity to his words, "there's a family at the gates who claim to have information that directly contradicts what Mrs. Darcus Pemberton has been telling you about her foundation's experimental treatment program." Prince William's first instinct was to ask questions that would help him understand the reliability of the information. His training in both royal protocol and military service had taught him to gather facts before making judgments, especially when those judgments could have far-reaching consequences. "What kind of information, Sergeant Mitchell?" Prince William asked, his voice quiet but focused. "And what have you been able to verify about this family's credibility?" Mitchell handed Prince William the tablet displaying the photographed documents from the Gonzalez family. As the prince studied the images, his expression gradually changed from polite attention to genuine concern. The letter bearing Mrs. Pemberton's signature told a story that was dramatically different from the one being presented in the blue drawing room. The experimental treatment program that Mrs. Pemberton had described as thriving and well-funded appeared, according to her own correspondence, to be facing serious financial difficulties that were preventing children from receiving promised care. The disconnect was not subtle. It was a fundamental contradiction that raised questions about either Mrs. Pemberton's honesty with the royal family or her competence in managing her organization. Prince William was quiet for several moments as he processed the implications. Through the open door to the blue drawing room, he could hear Mrs. Pemberton continuing her presentation to Mr. Harrison and Dr. Santos, her voice filled with enthusiasm as she described future plans for expanding the experimental treatment program. "The family at the gates," Prince William said finally. "Their child is one of those affected by this situation?" Mitchell nodded. 8-year-old Isabella Gonzalez. According to the documents, she was promised access to experimental leukemia treatment, but was recently informed that her placement was being postponed indefinitely. The parents claim that multiple families have received similar notifications, but that the foundation continues to fundraise as if the program is operating normally. The prince was facing a dilemma that went far beyond questions of royal protocol. If the allegations were true, then children were potentially dying while resources that could save them were being misused or mismanaged. But if the allegations were false, then he was considering disrupting important charitable work based on the claims of desperate parents who might be misunderstanding complex medical and administrative processes. Prince William's approach to such situations had been shaped by years of balancing royal responsibilities with genuine human concern. His work with various charities had taught him that good intentions didn't always translate to good outcomes, and that even well-meaning organizations could sometimes lose sight of their primary mission amid administrative and financial pressures. "I need to understand this situation fully before I can decide how to proceed," Prince William said. "Is there a way to speak with this family directly without creating a scene that might embarrass anyone unnecessarily?" Mitchell had anticipated this question and had already considered the logistical challenges. Bringing the family into the palace while Mrs. Rucott Pemberton was still present could create a confrontational situation that would be difficult for everyone involved. But leaving them at the gates while the meeting concluded would mean potentially missing the opportunity to address serious allegations about an organization that the royal family was considering for continued support. "We could bring the family to one of the smaller reception rooms," Mitchell suggested. "You could speak with them privately while the other charity representatives continue their presentations. If their information proves to be credible, you would then have the option of addressing the situation with Mrs. Pemberton before the meeting concludes." Prince William considered this approach carefully. It would allow him to gather information without immediately disrupting the ongoing meeting, but it would also mean conducting what amounted to an investigation into one of his charitable partners while that partner was in the building. The ethical complexities were significant. The prince's decision reflected both his sense of responsibility and his understanding that sometimes leadership required taking calculated risks in service of greater good. "Bring them in, Sergeant Mitchell, but let's handle this as discreetly as possible. I want to understand what they know without creating unnecessary drama for anyone involved." Mitchell immediately began coordinating the logistics through his radio system. Davies would escort the Gonzalez family through a side entrance that would avoid the main reception areas where they might be seen by Mrs. Pemberton or the other charity representatives. Chen would ensure that the corridor between the side entrance and the small reception room remained clear during the family's movement through the palace. Captain Thornton, who had been maintaining contact with the family at the gates, explained that they would be brought inside to meet with Prince William, but that they needed to understand the serious nature of the allegations they were making. If their information proved to be inaccurate, or if they had misunderstood the Foundation's communications, they could be putting both themselves and the royal family in a difficult position. Maria Gonzalez's response was immediate and firm. She understood the gravity of the situation, but she also understood that her daughter's life was at stake. If there was even a small chance that speaking directly to Prince William could help ensure that Isabella and other children received the treatment they had been promised, then she was willing to take whatever risks were necessary. Carlos added that they had brought additional documentation that they hadn't been able to show through the palace gates. Correspondence from other families in similar situations, financial records that raised questions about how the Foundation was using donated funds, and medical records that demonstrated Isabella's urgent need for the experimental treatment that was being delayed. As the Gonzalez family was escorted into the palace, Prince William returned to the blue drawing room to continue the meeting with the charity representatives. His demeanor remained professional and engaged, but Mitchell noticed a subtle change in the types of questions he was asking Mrs. Pemberton. "Mrs. Pemberton," Prince William said during a pause in her presentation, "I'm particularly interested in the experimental treatment program you've described. Could you give me some specific examples of recent success stories? Perhaps some families who have benefited from the program in the past few months?" Mrs. Pemberton's response was smooth and confident. She spoke about remarkable recoveries, grateful families, and the cutting-edge medical research that was making previously impossible treatments available to children with serious illnesses. Her statistics were impressive, her passion appeared genuine, and her command of the details seemed comprehensive. But Prince William was now listening with different ears. Having seen the letter bearing Mrs. Pemberton's signature that told a contradictory story, he was paying attention not just to what she said, but to what she didn't say. He noticed that her examples of success stories were somewhat vague, lacking the specific details that usually characterize genuine case studies. He also noticed that when pressed for recent examples, she tended to reference cases from earlier in the year rather than more current situations. Mr. Harrison and Dr. Santos continued to express admiration for the Foundation's work, and their own organization's positive experiences with Mrs. Pemberton suggested that she was capable of running effective charitable programs. This made the situation more complex rather than clearer. It was possible that the Foundation was doing excellent work in most areas while facing problems specifically with the experimental treatment program. In the small reception room, Davies was settling the Gonzalez family and ensuring they had everything they needed before Prince William arrived. Isabella sat quietly beside her parents, her colorful headscarf bright against the room's muted colors. Despite her obvious physical frailty, she maintained an alertness that was striking, her eyes taking in the elegant surroundings, while her mind clearly focused on the important conversation that was about to take place. Maria organized her documents carefully, arranging them in order of importance and relevance. The most crucial items were the recent correspondence from the Foundation, but she also had financial statements that showed discrepancies between what the Foundation reported to donors and what they reported to government oversight agencies. Carlos had prepared a timeline that showed how their family's experience with the Foundation had changed over the past year. from initial promise and enthusiasm to growing concerns and delayed treatments. When Prince William entered the reception room, the atmosphere immediately became more formal but not intimidating. His approach with the family demonstrated the diplomatic skills that had made him effective in countless challenging situations. He greeted each family member personally, acknowledging Isabella with particular gentleness while treating her as a person rather than just a patient. "Mrs. Gonzalez, Mr. Rowe." "Gonzalez, Isabella," he said, settling into a chair across from them. "Sergeant Mitchell has explained that you have concerns about the Children's Hospital Foundation that you believe I should be aware of. I want to hear what you have to say, and I want you to know that I take these matters very seriously." Maria began by explaining their family's initial involvement with the foundation. When Isabella was first diagnosed with leukemia, the traditional treatments had shown limited effectiveness. The foundation's experimental program had been presented as their daughter's best hope for survival, a cutting-edge therapy that was showing remarkable results in early trials. The application process had been lengthy and thorough, involving extensive medical evaluations and financial assessments. When Isabella was accepted into the program, the family had felt overwhelming relief and gratitude. The foundation staff had been supportive and professional, and Mrs. Pemberton herself had written a personal letter welcoming Isabella to the program and assuring the family that everything possible would be done to help their daughter. But over the following months, the family began to notice changes. Scheduled treatments were postponed due to equipment maintenance. Promised consultations with specialists were canceled and rescheduled repeatedly. Other families in the program reported similar experiences, and gradually a pattern emerged that suggested the program was facing serious operational problems. Carlos showed Prince William the timeline he had prepared, documenting how their family's experience with the foundation had deteriorated. Initial enthusiasm and prompt communication had given way to evasive responses and bureaucratic delays. When the family tried to get clear information about Isabella's treatment schedule, they were told repeatedly that the program was undergoing temporary restructuring, but that services would resume soon. The most damning evidence was the recent letter from Mrs. Pemberton herself informing the family that Isabella's treatment was being postponed indefinitely. The language in the letter was careful and technical, but the message was clear. The experimental program that had been presented as their daughter's best hope was no longer available to her. Prince William studied the documents carefully, comparing them with his own knowledge of the Foundation's recent presentations and funding requests. The inconsistencies were significant and troubling. If Mrs. Pemberton was aware that the experimental treatment program was facing serious problems, then her presentation in the blue drawing room was misleading at best. But Prince William also understood that medical research programs were complex and that setbacks and delays were sometimes unavoidable, even in well-managed organizations. The question was whether the Foundation was experiencing temporary difficulties that they were working to resolve, or whether they were systematically misrepresenting their capabilities to families, donors, and royal patrons. "Isabella," Prince William said, turning to address the young girl directly, "this must be very frustrating and scary for you. Can you tell me what this treatment means to you?" Isabella's response was remarkable for its maturity and clarity. Despite her age and illness, she spoke about her understanding of her medical situation with a precision that showed she had been involved in discussions about her care rather than simply being talked about by the adults around her. "The doctors say this treatment could help me get better," she said, her voice soft but steady. "My mom and dad have been working really hard to make sure I can have it. But now they say maybe I can't, and nobody will tell us why or when I might be able to. I just want to know the truth so we can make plans." The wisdom and dignity in her response struck Prince William profoundly. This was not just a case of administrative inefficiency or communication problems. This was about a child's life and her family's hope for her future. The stakes could not be higher, and the need for truth and clarity could not be more urgent. Prince William realized that he was facing one of those moments that would define not just how this particular situation was resolved, but how he approached the balance between royal protocol and human responsibility. The decision he made in the next few minutes would affect Isabella's future, her family's hope, and the royal family's relationship with charitable organizations that claim to serve the most vulnerable members of society. Prince William's mind raced as he processed the gravity of Isabella's words and the documents spread before him. The young girl's simple request for truth resonated deeply with his own sense of duty and responsibility. Here was a child facing a life-threatening illness, asking for nothing more than honesty about her chances for treatment, the most basic human dignity that anyone in her situation deserved. The prince excused himself briefly, explaining to the Gonzalez family that he needed to consult with his security team about the best way to address their concerns. In reality, He needed a moment to think through the implications of what he was about to do. The decision he was contemplating was unprecedented and would require him to confront Mrs. Pemberton directly with allegations that could destroy her professional reputation and potentially her organization's credibility. Mitchell was waiting in the corridor, and Prince William could see in the sergeant's expression that he understood the weight of the moment they were facing. 23 years of royal service had given Mitchell experience with difficult situations, but this combination of potential fraud, dying children, and royal diplomatic relationships was beyond anything in his previous experience.
Sergeant Mitchell, Prince William said quietly, I need you to arrange for Mrs.
Pemberton to join me in the reception room with the Gonzalez family. The other charity representatives should be asked to wait in the blue drawing room until I can return to them. Mitchell's training told him to question whether this was the wisest approach. Bringing Mrs. Pemberton face-to-face with her accusers while emotions were running high could create a volatile situation that might be difficult to control. But his respect for Prince William's judgment and his own growing conviction that the truth needed to be established outweighed his procedural concerns. Your Royal Highness, Mitchell said carefully, Mrs. Pemberton may not be prepared for this kind of direct confrontation. Should we consider giving her advance notice of the allegations so she can prepare her response? Prince William considered this suggestion but ultimately rejected it. If Mrs. Pemberton was innocent of the allegations, then advance warning would simply give her time to become anxious about a situation that would quickly be resolved. If she was guilty of misleading the royal family and the family she claimed to serve, then advance warning might give her time to prepare evasions or explanations that could further obscure the truth. I think the most fair approach is to present the information directly and allow Mrs. Norton Pemberton to respond immediately, Prince William said. If there's an innocent explanation for the discrepancies, she should be able to provide it without preparation. If there isn't an innocent explanation, then we need to know that as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, in the blue drawing room, Mrs. Pemberton was beginning to notice that Prince William's absence was extending longer than expected. Her experience with royal meetings had taught her that princes and other members of the royal family were typically very punctual and respectful of scheduled time. Extended interruptions usually indicated that something significant was developing. Mr. Harrison and Dr. Santos were chatting quietly about potential collaborative projects, but Mrs. Pemberton found herself glancing frequently at her watch and toward the door through which Prince William had exited. She tried to maintain her professional composure, but a nagging worry was beginning to develop in the back of her mind. Jennifer Walsh entered the blue drawing room to inform Mrs. Gilman Pemberton that Prince William requested her presence in the small reception room for a brief private consultation. The request was phrased politely and professionally, giving no indication of the serious nature of what awaited her. But Mrs. Pemberton's instincts told her that something unusual was happening. As she followed Walsh through the corridor toward the reception room, Mrs. Pemberton mentally reviewed her presentation and tried to anticipate what additional questions Prince William might have. She was confident in her organization's work and her own professional competence, but the formal nature of being called to a separate meeting was concerning. When Mrs. Pemberton entered the reception room and saw the Gonzalez family seated with Prince William, her professional composure faltered for just a moment. She recovered quickly, but not before Prince William noticed the flash of recognition and concern that crossed her features. It was clear that Mrs. Pemberton knew exactly who the family was and why their presence might be problematic for her. Mrs. Pemberton, Prince William said, gesturing to a chair across from the family, I'd like you to meet the Gonzalez family. They have some concerns about your foundation's experimental treatment program that I believe you should address directly. Mrs. Duplin, Pemberton's mind was working rapidly as she tried to assess the situation and determine the best way to respond. Her first instinct was to question why a private family matter was being discussed in the presence of Prince William, but she quickly recognized that challenging the appropriateness of the meeting would only make her appear defensive. Of course, Your Royal Highness, Mrs. Pemberton said, settling into the offered chair with as much dignity as she could muster. I'm always happy to discuss our programs with the families we serve. Maria Gonzalez wasted no time in presenting their concerns. She showed Mrs. Pemberton the letter bearing her signature that postponed Isabella's treatment indefinitely, and then contrasted it with the presentation that had just been given to Prince William, describing the experimental program as thriving and successful. Mrs. Pemberton, Maria said, her voice controlled but emotionally charged. Just an hour ago, you told Prince William that your experimental treatment program is your most successful initiative, but 2 weeks ago you wrote to us saying that the program is suspended indefinitely due to budgetary problems. Which statement is true? Mrs. Pemberton found herself in the kind of situation that public relations training could never adequately prepare someone for. She was being asked to reconcile contradictory statements in front of someone whose support was crucial to her organization's future, while a dying child and her desperate parents waited for an explanation that could affect their daughter's chances of survival. Her first attempt at a response was to suggest that there might be confusion about different aspects of the Foundation's work. The experimental treatment program, she explained, was indeed successful and well-funded overall, but certain specific treatments had to be temporarily suspended while new protocols were developed and approved by medical authorities. Carlos immediately challenged this explanation by showing additional correspondence from other families who had received similar notifications. The pattern suggested that the experimental program was facing systematic problems that affected multiple patients, not just occasional delays for specific treatments. Prince William watched the exchange carefully, paying attention not just to the substance of Mrs. Pemberton's explanations, but to her body language and the way she responded to direct questions. His experience with diplomatic negotiations had taught him to recognize when someone was being evasive versus when they were simply trying to explain complex situations. As the conversation continued, it became increasingly clear that Mrs. Pemberton was struggling to provide consistent explanations for the discrepancies between her public statements and her private correspondence with families. Her responses became more technical and bureaucratic, filled with references to regulatory requirements and administrative procedures that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify the situation. Isabella, who had been listening quietly to the adult conversation, spoke up with a question that cut through all the diplomatic language and bureaucratic explanations. "Mrs. Pemberton," she said, her young voice carrying surprising authority, "can you tell me when I will be able to start my treatment? Not maybe or probably, but when exactly will it happen?" The directness of the question from the child who would be most affected by Mrs. Pemberton's decisions created a moment of profound silence in the room. This was not about administrative procedures or fundraising strategies or royal relationships. This was about whether an 8-year-old girl would have access to treatment that could save her life. Mrs. Pemberton's response to Isabella's question would reveal more about her character and her organization's true situation than hours of diplomatic discussion could accomplish. Prince William leaned forward slightly, understanding that this was the moment when truth would either emerge or be definitively obscured. "Isabella," Mrs. Pemberton began, and then stopped. She looked at the young girl's hopeful face, at her parents' desperate expressions, at Prince William's expectant attention. For several seconds she seemed to struggle with competing impulses, the desire to maintain her professional reputation and the moral weight of honesty in the face of a child's need. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter and less confident than it had been throughout the morning. "Isabella, I need to be honest with you. The experimental treatment program is facing some serious challenges right now. We've had funding problems that we've been trying to solve, but they're more serious than we initially hoped they would be." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Mrs. Pemberton had just acknowledged, in front of Prince William, that her earlier presentation about the program's success had been misleading. More importantly, she had admitted to a dying child that the treatment that represented her best hope for survival was not actually available despite previous promises. Prince William felt a mixture of disappointment and admiration. Disappointment that Mrs. Pemberton had initially been less than truthful, but admiration for her eventual willingness to acknowledge the reality of the situation when directly confronted by the child who would be most affected by it. "Mrs. Pemberton," Prince William said carefully, "I appreciate your honesty with Isabella and her family. But I need to understand how this situation developed and what can be done to address it. If the experimental program is facing funding problems, why wasn't this information included in your presentation to me today?" Mrs. Pemberton's response revealed the pressures and compromises that had led to the current situation. The Foundation had initially received substantial grants for the experimental program, but costs had exceeded expectations while results had been slower to develop than hoped. Rather than risk losing royal support and other funding by admitting to problems, she had chosen to present an optimistic picture while working behind the scenes to find solutions. The explanation was understandable from a fundraising perspective, but it was morally questionable when it involved giving false hope to families of dying children. Mrs. Pemberton had allowed her desire to maintain her organization's reputation to override her obligation to be honest with the families she claimed to serve. Carlos asked the question that was in everyone's mind. "So what happens now? Is there any chance that Isabella and the other children can still receive treatment, or should we be looking for alternatives?" Mrs. Chance not to be the best. Pemberton's answer to this question would determine not just the immediate future for the Gonzalez family, but the broader relationship between her foundation and the royal family. Prince William waited to hear whether she would offer genuine solutions or continue to make promises that she might not be able to keep. The next few minutes would reveal whether this confrontation had been the beginning of a resolution to the problems affecting Isabella and other children, or whether it had simply exposed problems that were too serious to be easily fixed. Either way, Prince William knew that his response to Mrs. Pemberton's admissions would set a precedent for how the royal family dealt with charitable partners who failed to meet their obligations to the people they claimed to serve. The guards who had initiated this unprecedented chain of events by deciding to bring the Gonzalez family's concerns to royal attention waited in the corridor, knowing that their careers and the lives of children hung in the balance of the conversation taking place behind closed doors. The silence that followed Carlos's question stretched for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Mrs. Pemberton sat with her head slightly bowed, clearly weighing her words carefully. Prince William remained still, his expression unreadable, but his attention completely focused on whatever explanation or solution might be forthcoming. Isabella broke the silence in the way that only a child could, with the observation that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Mrs. Pemberton, I know you're trying to help children like me, but if the program isn't working, wouldn't it be better to tell everyone the truth so we can find something that does work? The wisdom in her simple statement seemed to crystallize something for Mrs. P. Hurd Pemberton. Her shoulders straightened slightly, and when she looked up, her expression had changed from defensive uncertainty to what appeared to be genuine resolve. You're absolutely right, Isabella, Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice stronger now. And I owe you and your family and Prince William a complete explanation of where we stand and what we can realistically do moving forward. What followed was a confession that transformed the entire dynamic of the morning. Mrs. Pemberton explained that the foundation had indeed received substantial funding for the experimental treatment program, but that the medical research had proven more complex and expensive than initially projected. Rather than admit to donors and supporters that the timeline and budget estimates had been unrealistic, she had chosen to continue fundraising while quietly trying to solve the problems. The result was that children like Isabella had been given hope for treatments that were not actually available, while donations intended for those treatments were being used to keep the foundation's general operations running. It was not intentional fraud, but it was a systematic pattern of misleading communication that had real consequences for real families. The truth is, Mrs. Pemberton continued, looking directly at Isabella rather than at Prince William, that we currently don't have the resources to provide the experimental treatment we promised you. But we do have partnerships with other organizations that might be able to help, and we have some of the original funding that was designated specifically for cases like yours. Prince William felt a complex mixture of emotions as he processed Mrs. Pemberton's admissions. His disappointment in her initial dishonesty was tempered by his recognition that she was now being genuinely truthful, even though that truth was damaging to her professional reputation. Her willingness to be honest with Isabella, despite the personal costs, suggested that there might still be a foundation for constructive action. Mrs. Pemberton, Prince William said, I appreciate your honesty, but I need to understand what concrete steps can be taken to help Isabella and the other families who have been affected by this situation. Good intentions and future possibilities are not enough. These families need real solutions. What happened next would be remembered by everyone in the room as the moment when Prince William demonstrated why he was respected not just as a royal figure, but as a leader capable of turning difficult situations into opportunities for positive change. Instead of simply withdrawing royal support from the foundation, or expressing disappointment in Mrs. Pemberton's handling of the situation, Prince William began to outline a path forward that could address both the immediate needs of affected families and the broader systemic problems that had created the crisis. I want to propose something, Prince William said, his tone becoming more decisive. Mrs. Pemberton, you mentioned partnerships with other organizations and remaining designated funds. I want you to work with my staff over the next 48 hours to develop a concrete plan for getting Isabella and every other child who was promised treatment into appropriate programs, whether through your foundation or through partnerships with other providers. He turned to address Isabella directly. Isabella, I want you and your family to know that we are going to make sure you get the medical care you need. It may not be exactly the program you were originally promised, but it will be treatment that gives you the best possible chance for recovery. Maria Gonzalez felt tears welling up in her eyes, not just from relief, but from the recognition that someone with real authority was finally taking their situation seriously and committing to concrete action rather than bureaucratic promises. But Prince William was not finished. His next words would create a framework for preventing similar situations in the future. Going forward, he said, addressing Mrs. Pemberton but speaking loudly enough for his words to carry into the corridor where his staff could hear, Any organization that receives royal support will be required to provide quarterly reports that include specific information about program availability, funding status, and any delays or problems that might affect the families they serve. We will not accept general assurances. We need detailed, verifiable information. The implications of this policy change extended far beyond Mrs. Pemberton's foundation. Prince William was establishing new standards of accountability for all charitable organizations that sought royal patronage. The effect would be to protect families like the Gonzalez family from being misled about available services, while also protecting the royal family from being unknowingly associated with mismanaged or dishonest organizations. Mrs. Pemberton nodded her agreement to these conditions, understanding that she was being given an opportunity to rebuild rather than simply being dismissed. Your Royal Highness, I accept full responsibility for the way this situation has been handled. I will work with your staff to ensure that Isabella and every other affected family receives appropriate care, and I will implement whatever oversight and reporting systems you require. Prince William's response showed both his pragmatic understanding of organizational challenges and his commitment to the humanitarian principles that guided his charitable work. Mrs. Pemberton, I believe that people can learn from their mistakes and that organizations can improve their practices when they're held to appropriate standards. What I need from you is not perfection, but transparency and genuine commitment to the families you serve. As the immediate crisis moved toward resolution, Prince William turned his attention to the broader implications of what had occurred that morning. The guards who had made the decision to bring the Gonzalez family's concerns to his attention had potentially saved Isabella's life, but they had also violated established protocols in doing so. In the corridor, Mitchell, Davies, and Chen were acutely aware that their careers hung in the balance. They had made decisions based on their judgment about what was right, rather than what was procedurally correct, and they were not certain how Prince William would view their actions. When Prince William emerged from the reception room, his first words addressed their concerns directly. Sergeant Mitchell, I want to thank you and your team for bringing this situation to my attention. You made a difficult decision under pressure and you made the right choice. The relief in Mitchell's expression was visible, but Prince William was not finished. However, I also want to work with you to develop protocols that will help us handle similar situations in the future. We need procedures that allow for humanitarian exceptions to security rules when circumstances warrant them, but we also need to ensure that such exceptions are made thoughtfully and with appropriate oversight. This approach reflected Prince William's characteristic leadership style, acknowledging when people had acted correctly while also working to improve systems and processes to prevent similar dilemmas from arising in the future. Rather than simply accepting that the guards had been forced to choose between protocol and conscience, he wanted to create frameworks that would allow both to be honored. The morning's events concluded with Prince William returning to the Blue Drawing Room to continue his meetings with Mr. Harrison and Dr. Santos. But the conversation that followed was different from what had been originally planned. Instead of simply receiving reports on existing charitable programs, Prince William engaged both representatives in discussions about how to strengthen accountability and transparency across all royal charitable partnerships. Mr. Harrison found himself volunteering his organization's experience with financial oversight systems that ensured donated funds were used exactly as promised to donors. Dr. Santos shared her organization's practices for providing regular, detailed updates to families affected by their programs, even when the news was not entirely positive. The result was the beginning of a new approach to royal charitable partnerships that would have lasting impact far beyond the immediate situation with Mrs. S. Pemberton's foundation. The morning that had begun as a routine series of charitable briefings had become the catalyst for systemic changes that would benefit countless families in the future. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the day's events was the role that Isabella herself had played in their resolution. Her simple questions and direct requests for truth had cut through adult complexities and diplomatic evasions to reach the heart of what mattered most, whether children who needed help would actually receive it. As the Gonzalez family prepared to leave the palace, Isabella approached Prince William with a question that would stay with him for years afterward. Prince William, do you think other children in situations like mine will be helped by what happened today? His response reflected both his genuine hope and his realistic understanding of the challenges involved in creating lasting change. Isabella, I think what happened today shows that when good people work together and insist on truth and fairness, it's possible to solve problems that seemed impossible. You and your family have helped not just yourselves, but other families who might face similar challenges in the future. The lasting legacy of that remarkable morning would be found not just in the immediate help provided to Isabella and other affected children, but in the new standards of accountability and transparency that emerged from the crisis. Mrs. Pemberton's foundation would eventually become a model for honest communication with families and supporters, while the enhanced oversight procedures would prevent similar situations from developing with other charitable partners. But perhaps most importantly, the events demonstrated that even the most rigid protocols and established procedures must sometimes yield to human needs and moral imperatives. The guards who chose to break protocol to help a desperate family, the prince who chose to confront uncomfortable truths rather than maintain diplomatic pleasantries, and the foundation director who ultimately chose honesty over reputation protection, all contributed to an outcome that served the highest principles of service and compassion. Mitchell would later reflect that in 23 years of royal service, he had never seen a situation where breaking the rules had so clearly served the purposes that the rules were meant to protect. The morning when the guards froze had become the morning when everyone involved learned that sometimes the most professional thing you can do is to be fundamentally human. Isabella's treatment began 2 weeks later through a partnership program that Mrs. Pemberton helped arrange with a research hospital in London. Her prognosis was good, and her family's gratitude to everyone involved in making her care possible was expressed in letters that Prince William kept in his personal files as reminders of why his charitable work mattered. The story spread quietly through palace circles as an example of crisis leadership and humanitarian decision-making, but it was never publicized beyond the people who were directly involved. Prince William preferred that the focus remain on the systemic improvements that resulted from the situation rather than on the drama of the confrontation itself. Years later, when Isabella was healthy and thriving in secondary school, she would occasionally think about the morning when her simple questions had helped adults find their way to truth and solutions. She never fully understood the complexity of the royal protocols that had been bent to accommodate her family's needs, but she never forgot the lesson that sometimes the most important thing you can do is to ask for honesty and refuse to accept anything less. The guards who had made the initial decision to bring her family's concerns to Prince William's attention continued their service with the knowledge that they had been part of something that mattered beyond the usual scope of their duties. They had learned that protecting the royal family sometimes meant protecting them from being unknowingly associated with failures of compassion and truth. And Mrs. Pemberton, who had faced the most difficult moments of her professional career that morning, eventually became one of the most trusted and effective charitable partners the royal family worked with. Her experience of being confronted with the consequences of her evasions had taught her that organizational success built on anything other than complete honesty was ultimately unsustainable. The morning that had begun with frozen guards ended with everyone involved having learned something valuable about the relationship between protocol and principle, between duty and humanity, and between the rules that govern institutions and the values that should guide the people who serve them.